My husband said it so casually, like he was commenting on the weather. "You've become a burden, Marjorie." He stood by the kitchen island, his silk tie loosened after another long day at the office. His tone wasn't angry or even frustrated. It was matter of fact, which somehow made it worse. We'd built everything together from the ground up, starting with nothing but a dream and a maxed-out credit card. That company, the one that now generated $25 million annually, existed because I'd worked 70-hour weeks while he networked at golf courses. I didn't scream or throw anything. I just looked at this man, my husband of 38 years, and realized something terrifying. He actually believed what he was saying. The silence stretched between us like a canyon. He poured himself scotch from the crystal decanter I'd bought him for our anniversary. Then he said the words that would become his biggest mistake. "I'll handle the paperwork. The company should be in my name anyway." I smiled. He had no idea what he'd just set in motion. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay beside him listening to his steady breathing, wondering how I'd missed the signs. When had I stopped being his partner and become his obstacle? I slipped out of bed at 3 a.m. and went to his study. The original business and corporation files were kept in the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk, the one I'd helped him pick out at an estate sale 15 years ago. My hands trembled as I pulled out the folder. I'd been the one to file all the paperwork when we started the company. I'd drafted every clause, negotiated every term, signed every document. As I read through the pages, something caught my eye. His name was listed as operational director, not majority owner. I almost laughed through my tears. He'd been so busy playing CEO that he'd never actually read the documents he signed. The company wasn't his to take. It never had been. I owned 60% of his shares. He owned 30%. The remaining 10% belonged to our original investor. The next morning, he acted like nothing had happened. He kissed my cheek before leaving for work, told me he'd be home late, asked me to pick up his dry cleaning. I played along. I smiled and nodded and promised to have dinner ready whenever he arrived. But as soon as his car pulled out of the driveway, I made a phone call I'd been putting off for 15 years. Henry Dorsey answered on the third ring. His voice was older now, rougher around the edges, but still sharp. "Marjorie Thane," he said slowly, like he was tasting my name. "I thought you'd vanished into suburban obscurity." I gripped the phone tighter. "I almost did, but I'm ready to reclaim what's mine." There was a pause, then a low chuckle. "So the king has finally revealed himself as a fool?" I smiled despite everything. "Not yet. But I'm about to show him what gravity feels like." During a pause in our conversation, when he'd stepped away to take a phone call, I heard another voice faintly in the background of his end. A woman's voice, young and bright, saying something I couldn't quite make out. I spent the next 2 days digging. Credit card statements revealed lunch charges at expensive restaurants on days he'd told me he was in meetings. Hotel receipts for conferences I knew he hadn't attended. And then I found the text messages on an old phone he'd forgotten in his gym bag. Her name was Elise Rowan, his assistant, 28 years old with a business degree and apparently no conscience. The messages went back 6 months. Plans for a future together. Promises that once he freed himself from the burden, they could finally be together. I didn't cry. I poured myself a glass of wine and whispered to my empty kitchen, "Let them plan. I'll set the stage." I started moving money quietly. Small amounts at first, transferred from accounts he never checked into a private trust I'd established through Henry. My husband was so focused on his grand plan that he never noticed the subtle shifts. Each week, another 100,000 disappeared from dormant subsidiaries. Each month, another property deed transferred from joint ownership to my name alone. Henry helped me identify every asset my husband thought he controlled. The beach house in Malibu? Purchased with my inheritance. The investment portfolio worth $3 million? Built from my father's estate. The company itself? Founded on my idea, my capital, my relentless work. By the end of the 3rd week, I'd secured everything that mattered. The only thing left was the company itself. And for that, I had a buyer lined up. Someone my husband had dismissed years ago as too sentimental for business. Someone who was about to own everything. Henry Dorsey's signature went on the contract on a Tuesday morning. The company that my husband thought he owned now belonged to the man he'd once mocked at a board meeting. I remembered that day clearly. Henry had suggested we donate a percentage of profits to a scholarship fund. My husband had laughed and called it bleeding heart nonsense. Now Henry owned 51% of the company, with a contract ensuring I retained permanent control as a silent managing partner. The sale would finalize in 72 hours. My husband had no idea. That evening, he brought me flowers. White lilies, my favorite. I almost laughed at the timing. Men like him always thought a gift could disguise betrayal. Over dinner, he smiled and squeezed my hand. "You'll feel so much lighter after tomorrow," he said. "I've arranged everything with the lawyers. Simple transfer of shares. You won't have to worry about business decisions anymore." I looked at him and smiled back. Tomorrow, he thought I'd sign my power away. Tomorrow, he'd discover the company he planned to steal had already been sold. At midnight, I called Elise from an unlisted number Henry had provided. She answered on the fourth ring, her voice thick with sleep. "You don't know me," I said calmly. "But you will soon. Meet me tomorrow at the cafe on 52nd Street. 10 in the morning. Come alone." She tried to ask who I was, but I hung up. The next morning, she arrived 15 minutes early. I watched her through the cafe window, nervously checking her phone, looking around like she expected an ambush. When I sat down across from her, the color drained from her face. "Mrs. Lowell," she whispered. I didn't scold her or make a scene. I just listened as she confessed everything. The affair had started innocently enough, she claimed. Late nights at the office. Shared ambitions. He told her I was cold, distant, that our marriage had been dead for years. He'd promised to leave me once the company was fully in his name. He'd promised her a new life, funded by money he was moving to offshore accounts. She showed me the account number on her phone, tears streaming down her face. I recognized it immediately, because that offshore bank required my authorization for any transactions. The lawyer's office was on the 43rd floor of a building downtown. My husband arrived at 9 sharp, confident and relaxed. He thought he was walking into a simple signing ceremony. Instead, he found Henry Dorsey sitting at the conference table alongside our company's legal counsel. I was already there, dressed in the navy suit I'd worn to our first major business presentation 20 years ago. When he saw me, confusion flickered across his face. "Marjorie? What's going on? Where are the transfer papers?" Henry slid a folder across the polished table. "These are the only papers that matter," he said calmly. "Confirmation that the company has been sold." My husband froze. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. "Sold," he finally managed. "To me," Henry replied. "Approved and executed by your wife, who owns the controlling shares." I watched my husband's face cycle through emotions. Confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally fear. "That's impossible," he said, his voice rising. "I built this company. It's mine." I took a sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch. Then I spoke for the first time. "Congratulations, darling. You're officially unemployed." He didn't come home that night, or the night after. His lawyer started calling by the end of the week, making threats that meant nothing. Every document was legal. Every transfer was legitimate. Every step could be traced back to his own negligence and my careful planning. But I wasn't satisfied with just legal victory. I wanted the world to understand what he'd done. So I called an old friend who worked at the business section of a major newspaper. I didn't name names. I didn't have to. I simply told her a story about women who built empires only to be erased from their own narratives. About silent architects whose work was claimed by louder voices. The article ran on a Sunday morning. By Monday afternoon, his face was everywhere. Social media exploded with comments from people who'd experienced similar betrayals. Former employees came forward with stories of how he took credit for their ideas. Business partners revealed meetings where I'd done all the negotiating while he took all the glory. The headline that destroyed him: CEO loses multi-million empire to ex-wife after calling her a burden. My house was finally quiet. No footsteps pacing upstairs at midnight. No phone calls behind closed doors. No scent of cologne mixed with lies. I made tea and sat by the window, watching news vans pull up to film the mansion we'd shared. Reporters wanted my side of the story. I declined every interview. My silence, I'd learned, was far more powerful than any statement I could make. People said I looked serene in the photos they managed to capture. They didn't understand that calm wasn't the same as peace. Sometimes calm was just the sound of a storm finally finishing what it started. Then my lawyer called. His voice was tense. "Marjorie, your ex-husband is filing a lawsuit. He's claiming emotional manipulation and theft." I almost laughed. After everything he'd done, he was playing the victim. "Let him file," I said. "We have recordings. We have documents. We have witnesses." My lawyer paused. "There's something else. He subpoenaed Elise Rowan. He's going to claim you coerced her into helping you." I smiled. He had no idea what was coming. The courtroom was colder than I'd expected. He arrived wearing a new suit, probably bought with borrowed money since his accounts were frozen. He wouldn't look at me directly, which was fine. I had no problem staring. His lawyers were expensive and theatrical. They painted me as a manipulative wife who deceived her devoted husband for decades. They claimed I'd hidden my ownership stake to trap him. They suggested I'd orchestrated everything out of jealousy over Elise. I sat quietly through all of it. When my turn came, I walked to the front and handed the judge a flash drive. It contained every email my husband had sent planning to steal the company. Every text message to Elise discussing their future with my money. Every offshore transfer he'd attempted using my forged signature. The courtroom went silent as the judge reviewed the evidence. Even my husband's lawyers seemed to shrink in their seats. The judge looked up, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Lowell," she said carefully, "do you want to change your plea before we proceed?" He looked at his lawyers. They looked at each other. Nobody said a word. That night, I couldn't sleep again. But this time it wasn't from anxiety. It was from the weight of memory. I went down to the basement and opened my father's old lockbox, the one I'd kept meaning to sort through after he died. Inside were documents I'd forgotten existed. Business contracts from the early days. Letters of investment. And then I found it, a handwritten will, dated 3 years before my father's death. It stated clearly that the original company shares, the ones that became the foundation of our $25 million empire, were gifted solely to me. My husband had never owned any part of the business's foundation. He'd built his castle on land that was never his to begin with. This document was the final piece. Absolute proof that every claim he'd made in court was based on a lie. As I placed the will back in the box, I noticed another envelope underneath. It was addressed to me in my father's handwriting, sealed with red wax. My hands shook as I opened it. The letter was brief, but devastating. "Marjorie," my father had written, "if you're reading this, someone has tried to take what's yours. Don't destroy them with anger. Show the world the value they overlooked. Your mother and I didn't raise you to seek revenge. We raised you to build legacies that outlast small men with loud voices. The money in the hidden account will help you start something new, something that matters more than profit. Make us proud." Tears blurred my vision as I read those words. My father had known. Somehow, he'd seen this coming years before it happened. The next day, I made a decision. I used the money from the sale to establish the Marjorie Thane Foundation for Women in Business. We would fund female entrepreneurs whose ideas had been stolen. We would provide legal support for women fighting ownership battles. We would create a legacy my father would be proud of. While my husband drowned in scandal and legal fees, I was building something that would matter long after we were both gone. A week later, an email arrived from an anonymous sender. The subject line read, "One last secret." Inside was a detailed message explaining that my husband still had one offshore account I didn't know about. An account in the Cayman Islands, established 5 years ago, containing nearly $2 million. The email included account numbers, passwords, and transaction records. What caught my attention was the signature authority. Both our names were listed, but the account had been opened with my forged signature. I went to the bank the next morning. The manager was professional but nervous when I explained the situation. After 2 hours of verification and legal documentation, I had full access. The withdrawal history showed my husband had been planning to empty the account the following week. He was going to disappear with money he'd stolen using my identity. I made one simple transaction. I transferred every dollar to the foundation. When he showed up 3 days later to claim the money, the banker smiled politely and said, "Mrs. Lowell already handled that account." That evening, his lawyer called me personally. The lawyer's voice was shaking. "He's gone, Marjorie. Left the state, maybe the country. He abandoned his appeals, fired his legal team, disappeared. But he left something for you." A letter arrived the next day in a plain envelope. The postmark was from a small town in Montana I'd never heard of. Inside was his handwriting, messier than I remembered, like he'd been drinking when he wrote it. "Marjorie, if you're reading this, I've already left. I know you won, but before you decide how to remember me, there's something you never knew." I read every word twice. He wasn't apologizing. He wasn't begging for forgiveness. He was confessing. According to his letter, the original idea for our company hadn't come from either of us. He'd stolen it from my late brother, Graham, who died in a car accident 23 years ago. Graham had been developing a digital restaurant management system. After his death, my husband had taken Graham's notes, filed patents under his own name, and built our empire on stolen innovation. At the bottom of the letter was a name I hadn't heard in decades, Elias Crown, Graham's business partner. I found Elias living in a small town in Vermont, in a cabin surrounded by snow and silence. He opened the door before I could knock, like he'd been expecting me for years. "I knew you'd come eventually," he said quietly. "Your husband contacted me 3 weeks ago. Wanted to make sure I'd stay quiet." He invited me inside. The cabin was modest but comfortable, filled with books and photographs. One picture on the mantel showed my brother Graham, young and smiling, standing next to Elias. They both wore college sweatshirts. Elias made tea and told me everything. He and Graham had spent 2 years developing the restaurant management system. They'd been about to seek investors when Graham died. A week after the funeral, my husband had approached Elias, claiming Graham had wanted him to continue the project. Elias, grief-stricken and trusting, had handed over all their research. By the time he realized what was happening, the patents were filed, and the company was launched. "I should have fought him," Elias said, staring into his tea. "But I was young and scared. He had lawyers. I had student debt." He slid a folder across the table. "There's one more thing you need to know, Marjorie. Your husband didn't steal this alone." I opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were bank statements, investment records, and a document that made my breath catch. My mother's signature. She had helped him. In the months after Graham's death, when I was drowning in grief and barely functional, my mother had secretly invested $50,000 in my husband's new company. The paperwork showed she believed she was helping secure my future. She had no idea he was using her money to erase Graham's name from his own invention. All those years, I'd thought my mother disapproved of my husband. She'd been distant at family gatherings, cool during holiday visits. Now I understood. She'd been living with guilt, unable to tell me what she'd done. Unable to admit she'd helped destroy my brother's legacy while trying to protect mine. Attached to the bank statements was another document. A property deed for land near Lake Eversfield, registered in my mother's maiden name. Elias looked at me carefully. "She left that property to you in a separate will. I was named executor. She made me promise not to tell you about it until after she was gone. My mother had died 2 years ago. I'd never known about this property. The drive to Lake Eversfield took 4 hours through winding mountain roads. The cabin sat at the edge of the water, surrounded by pine trees and memories I didn't know existed. The key Elias had given me still worked. Inside, everything was frozen in time. Furniture covered with white sheets. photographs on the walls showing my family from decades ago. And beneath a loose floorboard in the bedroom, I found my mother's diary. Her handwriting was shaky in the final entries, written just weeks before she died. If Marjorie ever finds this place, she'd written, tell her I tried to protect her. I gave him that money to keep him from exposing Graham's secret. A secret that would have destroyed our entire family. I turned the page, my heart pounding. Graham didn't just create that management system. He discovered that several major restaurant chains were involved in financial fraud. He was going to expose them. His death wasn't an accident. I've always known that. And I gave money to Marjorie's husband because he promised to keep Graham's research buried, to keep our family safe. The final line broke me. If she learns the truth, tell her forgiveness is the only inheritance worth keeping. I stayed at the lake house for 3 weeks. I couldn't face the real world yet, couldn't process what I'd learned. My entire life had been built on secrets and sacrifices I'd never known existed. My brother hadn't died in a simple accident. My mother had lived with terrible knowledge. My husband had exploited grief for profit. Everything I'd thought I understood about my family was wrong. I spent my days walking along the lake, trying to untangle the web of lies and good intentions. My mother had made a terrible choice, but she'd made it out of love. My husband had made a calculated choice out of greed. There was a difference. One morning, as sunlight touched the water and turned it gold, I made a decision. I would write everything down. Every truth, every betrayal, every moment of redemption. Not for revenge, but for clarity. For anyone else who'd ever been called a burden. For anyone who'd ever had their work stolen. For anyone trying to make sense of family secrets that span generations. Because somewhere out there, my ex-husband was still alive. And I was ready for one final confrontation. The call came at dawn. A blocked number. A voice I recognized despite the years and distance. Marjorie, he said quietly. I'm here. One last time. He gave me directions to an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the city. I drove through empty streets as the sun rose, wondering if this was a trap or genuine remorse. Inside the warehouse, he waited. He looked older, thinner, haunted by choices that had finally caught up to him. I thought I could outrun it all, he said without greeting. The lies, the guilt, what I did to Graham, what I did to you. I didn't speak. I let the silence stretch between us like a chasm. Finally, I said, do you even remember who you were before you became this? He nodded slowly. Every day. That's the worst part. He handed me a small metal box, the kind used for important documents. I want you to have this before I disappear for good. Inside were the original patents Graham had filed. Signed confessions detailing everything my husband had done. Bank records showing exactly how he'd built our company on stolen work. Everything I would need to clear my brother's name. I held the box carefully, feeling its weight. You always had the power, my husband whispered. I just had the ego to think I could hide it. For the first time since this all began, I felt something other than anger. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. He'd made choices that destroyed lives, including his own. He'd chosen greed over integrity, pride over partnership. And now he was choosing to give me the truth, even though it couldn't undo the damage. What will you do now? I asked. He shook his head. Disappear. Start over somewhere no one knows my name. Try to become someone I can live with. I wanted to say something profound, something that would tie everything together neatly. But life wasn't neat. It was messy and complicated, and full of people making terrible choices for complex reasons. So I simply said, goodbye. I walked out of that warehouse carrying my brother's legacy, my mother's sacrifice, and my own hard-won freedom. Behind me, my husband vanished into the shadows, a ghost of the man I'd once loved. The drive home felt longer than it should have. I kept thinking about everyone involved in this story. Graham, whose brilliance had been stolen. My mother, who'd made an impossible choice. Elias, who'd stayed silent out of fear. I smiled through my tears. Graham and I had always been partners, even before we understood what that meant. Now I would honor that partnership by making sure his name lived on. I established the Graham Thane Innovation Fund, specifically for young inventors whose ideas deserved protection and support. 6 months have passed since everything changed. The foundation is thriving. We've helped 47 women reclaim their businesses and protected countless innovations from being stolen. Graham's name is being restored to the patents he created. My mother's sacrifice, while painful, makes sense now within the full context of her love and fear. And me? I sit at my desk each morning, looking out over a city that once represented betrayal, but now represents possibility. I've learned that being called a burden was the greatest gift my husband ever gave me. It forced me to examine what I'd built, what I tolerated, and what I truly valued. I could have accepted his version of reality. I could have signed those papers and faded into obscurity. Instead, I chose to fight with intelligence, patience, and the kind of quiet strength that terrifies men who mistake silence for weakness. The empire may have been sold, but the legacy I'm building now is indestructible, because it's not based on ego or theft or lies. It's based on truth, on honoring stolen brilliance, and on proving that the women they call burdens are often the foundation holding everything up. My story isn't about revenge. It's about reclamation. And I'm just getting started. I once believed my life could be measured by the wealth I built with my own hands, or the loyalty of those I trusted. But I've learned something far more valuable. Strength isn't loud. Revenge isn't cruel. True power is knowing your worth, reclaiming your story, and walking away with your head held high. They called me a burden. They tried to break me. And yet, here I am, wiser, unshakable, and free. So I ask you, if someone tried to define your life by their cruelty, how would you respond? Would you crumble? Or would you rise, like I did? Put your thought on the comment section and kindly subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Thanks for watching.